So we weren't really asked to prepare anything in advance, so these are kind of just my off-the-cuff kind of thoughts and what I've taken from this meeting. I made a couple of notes, but I mean, my research, and basically what I'm really interested in is the neural basis of processes that happen outside of awareness, and particularly the dynamic unconscious, the classic psychoanalytic unconscious, and look what's the neural basis of things like repression, suppression, dissociation. There are a lot of really interesting cases. I was describing to Ned over lunch a case of a patient with dissociative identity disorder where in one state she claimed to be blind, in another state she could see, and when they did voc potentials from V1, actually she had no responsivity in V1 in her blind state, which is really amazing. So there's a lot that the brain can do, and a lot is happening. I would say much of what's happening in our brain is happening outside of awareness, and consciousness is just a little piece of the picture. So why are we placing so much importance on consciousness? Yes, it's how we subjectively experience the world, but since so much is going on outside of awareness, why don't we place value on that as well? So when we're looking at these people and evaluating them in these different states of, let's say, minimally conscious state, or determining whether someone in a persistent vegetative state is or is not in that state, we have these amazing measures that people like Adrian and Nico and a variety of others here are all coming up with to try to detect consciousness. But is that the only question? What about the potential for consciousness? So we think about a baby in utero, maybe it doesn't have much consciousness, but we value its life. And we're not going to just say, oh, let's just kill it off, especially after a certain level of development, because of the potential for consciousness. So is there a way to measure the potentiality for consciousness in these different types of patients? One thing that Tim had mentioned was about, this differentiation between the contents of consciousness and level of wakefulness. And one question is, what does that mean? How do you measure the content of consciousness on a scale like that? It's not really the amount of consciousness you're looking at, and perhaps it's something like the potential for consciousness. You can think of that kind of axis as that. I guess another thing is about the ethical considerations. If you do detect something in a patient, maybe they're processing something, again, outside of awareness that's still having an effect on this being as a being, even if they're not consciously aware. And how much value do we place on that? And do we put them in stimulating environments? All these kinds of questions. Who's going to pay for that, to just have a stimulating environment for a person who's like in a minimally conscious state? But that might be very valuable for the person. In terms of theoretical things, a lot of people talked about like ITT, and Julie Tenerdy's integrated information theory, or the global workspace theory. One problem I have with ITT is that when I think about all these unconscious processes that are very complex, that are taking place, that are affecting our behavior in very meaningful ways, we know that it's engaging, and we can see that it's engaging many areas in the brain that we're assuming, and again, we can't precisely measure the amount of phi that a system has, but we assume that it entails a high degree of integrated information in the brain. So if so, then that defeats the sort of theory, right? Because those then would have to have some level of consciousness, but they're not. And so Julia, has said to me, well, maybe there's these little modules of consciousness within the brain, but they just don't know about each other. But again, that takes away from what I think the definition of consciousness is. So if part of my brain is conscious, but I don't know about it, that doesn't really feel like it's conscious to me. Also, the other thing that I was thinking about during the presentation this morning was during Alex's presentation about the different levels of anesthesia was everybody had mentioned the problems with not being put under enough, right? If you wake up and it's not heavy enough. But what are the problems of going down too deep? Everyone said, okay, it's problematic to go too far under anesthesia, but why exactly? If the person is on a breathing machine, if you can pump blood through their body, what is specifically the mechanism? Why would having too far under be a problem? And my question wasn't really answered. Are there people who don't wake up? And that there would have to be the case if his theory is correct, if there are these different attractor states, and the reason that people in different types of coma can't get out of it is because they're trapped in this certain brain state and they just can't get out of it, well then there would have to be a case where someone goes so far under anesthesia that they get into one of those brain states that they can't get out of. And so these are sort of questions that I've been thinking about. I think that's probably my 5 minutes, and I'd be happy to take questions. And yeah. Is there a mic?
I'm here.
Is there a mic?
I take that or not, but if you don't. I could try to take it, but with
it's speculative, so I don't have an answer. Well, one thing that is true is that when people emerge from anesthesia, a lot of people don't quite recover to themselves, and at least some fraction of people definitely become delirious. That much is true. There is also a lot of literature on people who have a sort of a permanent or a long-lasting, anyways, cognitive derangement after anesthesia. How true that is in clinical settings is hard to say because these tend to be elderly people and they have multiple medical problems, they have surgery, they're in the hospital, there are many reasons for them to have cognitive decline, but there's at least the supposition that this happens. Now, why don't people get trapped? So, although I said that these states are stable, but in a normal brain, at least as far as the rat is concerned, these transitions occur spontaneously. So, and that's kind of, these are two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, the stabilization of certain states shrinks the space of possibilities that the brain has to search. On the other hand, of course, they impede recovery because they stabilize a certain state of the brain. So if they were too stable, then of course, as you said, you would expect that somebody would not recover. But I think that's kind of the point, that these states, while they're stable enough, they're not ultimately stable. That's why we refer to them as metastable by sort of analogy to physical systems. And in a normal brain, at least in a normal rat brain, they eventually do get out. Is it possible now if somebody had some sort of a brain lesion or some other deficit that the states would become ultimately stable and would be trapped forever? It's possible, and the only clear example of this is narcolepsy, where they ultimately wake up, but it takes 6-7 hours for them to wake up, and they have no more anesthetic on board. So, you know, it's hard to say why doesn't that happen more often, but a normal brain seems to have some sort of a self-tuning mechanism that allows it to recover, and that's...
So I guess the follow-up is then why is it, and I guess you were talking about it's so dangerous to go too deep. Yeah.
So if I could continue, first of all, I think if you give an anesthetic and induce even isoelectric or isoelectric-like EEG for several hours, the subject or patient will recover normally. It's no problem. And I'm not aware of cases that we will have an adequate blood pressure and ventilation and the patient would not recover. It's not possible. Of course, there are patients who do not recover from anesthesia, but then something has happened, a catastrophe in the surgery or serious blood pressure drop. We have failed in delivering safe anesthesia, but it's not related to the drugs itself. Everybody will recover if we maintain blood pressure and temperature and breathing. No problem, I can guarantee that. Then the, you were asking about this too deep anesthesia. I believe strongly that too deep is deleterious to compromised brain, children and elderly. And there are some studies demonstrating that cognitive impairment, delirium, and really long-lasting, several months-lasting cognitive impairment is more common if you give too much of the anesthetic. Small studies, but I think we would need really big studies to show what is the real benefit of optimizing the doses. But I believe in optimizing the doses.
Okay, so being a neurologist, I get referred cases that Alex doesn't. And so I have an empirical. Not too often, but you're aware of this kind of thing, right? Yeah, you might come to me occasionally. Right? People see things. So I have a lot of empirical examples that would fill in your demographic, and I think the answer is affirmative. Okay, so it's a very frequent phenomenon of people over 65 going into general anesthesia, and it can go on for months, and people will not return their measured cognitive baseline for months. It's a target for intervention, and I think the way to think about it is in the context of the same thing that I showed you in the Zoltanov case. I didn't spend a lot of time on it, but this idea that the frontal brain downregulates through a variety of mechanisms, and then if you're elderly, it's a little bit less active anyway, and apparently it can take a very long time to come up. Now, Henry mentioned these studies in infants. There's a recent literature in the last year or two talking about the role of general anesthesia early in life in neurogenesis. So now it's also possible that there's adult stem cell recruitment throughout your lifetime that are fought by fluorouracil, the compounded the woman who Joe talked about yesterday who had the enzyme deficiency, put her into encephalopathy. is often used to look in autopsy studies at the role of regeneration of new neurons, even in adults with brain tumor, and there's a non-trivial rate. So it could be that in the elderly brain, there's a greater risk to whatever remains of this progenitor pool, and anesthesia kills them for some period of time. Jet lag does the same thing, apparently, even in adult animals, if you do enough of it. So, and there's about a 6-week delay on recovery. But I've also had cases that fit the other extreme. So that's the high end. But we've had people, and it's usually because they have, I think it's because they have some vulnerability at the receptor level, particularly in the dopamine compartment, who have taken really long times to come out of anesthesia. Like, forget about narcolepsy, 6 hours. We're talking like a day, and end up in the emergency room, akinetic, looking like they're in vegetative state. And it's in one case where this happened, 3 out of like 12 anesthesias they've had. And it's a very interesting thing. A long time ago, one of the things that Emery and I didn't talk about in our article that Henry showed, but it's very interesting, was the use of neuroleptic anesthesia in the 1970s. So in the 1970s, people used Haldol for anesthesia. It's one of the reasons the veterinarians aren't allowed to use droperidol anymore, because Haldol will put you into an akinesia that looks like you're unresponsive, but basically putting you into a weight lock-in state, like the akinetic Parkinsonian syndrome. And so I think that there's a whole bunch of examples to fill that in. So I think the answer is it does work, just as you propose.
Yeah, the Parkinson's patients is a good example of that. I mean, the reality is that a lot of, I do mostly anesthesia for neurosurgery, so when I see Parkinson's patients, they usually are awake for surgery because it involves deep brain stimulator implantation. But if a Parkinson's patient has surgery that doesn't involve the brain, they can take a day, sometimes they have to go into the ICU. This happens. Another thing that's worth noting, since Nico picked up on children, there's a lot of literature that exposure to anesthetics in children can cause long-lasting effects. Like you can measure learning disability and such things, when they are 10 years out from their surgery. There's a lot of these longitudinal studies that are really tough to really make sure that this is due in fact to anesthesia rather than whatever else, but there certainly are reasons to suspect that that might be the case, and there's lots of data in vitro in animals that anesthetics can be neurotoxic in the developing brain, affect neurogenesis, affect synaptic function, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, you can be trapped. And also when I'm measuring these things, these are very global things. I mean, I could not distinguish using spectral analysis whether the rat is thinking about playing tennis or whatever else it's thinking about. It's just sort of very coarse measure of brain activity, and we can make it much, much better, and we will, but at this point, that's what we have. We should move on.
Okay, the next presentation.
I'm just going to sit here. Yeah. So I want to raise one issue that's come up repeatedly, which is that the work on consciousness and disorders of consciousness and in anesthesia seems to neglect the question of what capacities can operate unconsciously. So, for example, and we know a lot about this, not as much as would be nice to know, but for example, someone mentioned, I think at some point, the work of Simon van Gaal on the unconscious no-go signal. The idea is that you can get an unconscious percept that allows the subject to stop doing something or not do something. That looks like an executive function process. So, if it is, then maybe executive function can operate unconsciously. In many of these experimental paradigms, well, the executive function paradigm is clearly a case where that unconscious executive function would be relevant. In almost all the paradigms, attention is required. Even the movie paradigm, the person has to want to attend to the movie, or at least has to attend to it. I'm certainly quite capable of ignoring something on TV and not attending to it and not registering it. So even in the movie paradigm, there's the issue of whether the subject is attending, and if so, whether the attention is unconscious. So Robert Kentridge has shown visual attention in blind sight and also object-based visual attention in normal people that's unconscious, where they can't even see the stimuli. There's executive function, attention. Another sort of very broad category is the category of cognition. So a few people have mentioned a lot of, in fact, Eric mentioned a number of experiments in which it looks like we have unconscious inference, unconscious categorization. I think the most dramatic ones are ones where they derive from unconscious perception, which we now know how to do in a pretty reliable way. If the subject is responding, following an instruction, for example, that requires understanding the instruction, wanting to follow it, deciding if the instruction is to say whether it's like A or B or something. That requires sort of some kind of cognition about what the options are, and some kind of decision process about which of the options is the right one, and then marshaling resources to do something to indicate that. These are all cognitive processes in the sense of involving thought and reasoning, and probably, quite a few of them can be done unconsciously. So I think if the work on disorders of consciousness and levels of consciousness in anesthesia is to really become more, to deal with this issue, I think people doing it have to pay more attention to what can and cannot be done unconsciously. And I should say, by the way, that Stan DeHaan's recent book has a chapter on what can be done unconsciously and what cannot. And, I don't agree with his theoretical perspective, and it's certainly not the last word, but it's anybody working in this area would do well to read those two chapters. They're excellent summaries of, not just summaries, but excellent, sort of accounts of the literature on this, and there is quite a bit of it. So I guess I'm only making one point, which is that the literature on disorders of consciousness ought to pay more attention to this set of literatures about what can and cannot be done unconsciously. Oh, I do want to say one other thing, which is that one thing that hasn't really come up much is the extent to which some of the patients who aren't doing anything have a disorder of the will. This is a little bit extraneous to my point, but and I don't know any work on this, but just they don't want to, they're not interested or something. I've seen. Well, anyway, somebody can speak to that who knows something.
Okay, you need to pull up it. Okay, so, sorry, I'm facing the audience. I'm actually not being a good host here.
Thank you very much. I agree a lot with your general comment, Ned, meaning that I think there is a bridge to be made between the two fields, and between the field of non-conscious cognition in completely other conditions. And I would like to make just 2 points. The first is that I mentioned the works of Simon Van Gaal, who was also postdoc in the lab. And so these work are very interesting, but in many aspects, that's one of the points I tried to make yesterday in one short digression, is that you have some processes which can occur non-consciously in the fact that the subject is not aware of the stimulus of the process, but many of them occur only if the subject is in a conscious posture of doing the task. So for instance, when you have the no-go signal, that is to say, for those of you who don't know, you have a stimuli on the screen, and you have to answer, and you are trained to repress your answer for a stimulus which has a code for you. You explicitly learn the code, no-go signal. And when you do that, you intermingle between consciously perceptible stimuli, some masked trials. And when you do that, and you repeat on hundreds of trials, you can indeed see some small effect of inhibition, genuine ones, for the non-consciously perceived type. But these effects appear only if the subject is consciously, and that's the same thing for the spatial attention and temporal attention of Bob Kentridge, and we did the same thing. So when you pay attention to time, consciously, this impact also non-conscious processing in this window of time, and the same for the space. And so just to make the story that it's even very subtle, because you have some non-conscious processes, but if you observe them, it would probably mean that the subject is conscious to allow them to occur, which is kind of counterintuitive, but we can try to understand. And for the last point, I think you are perfectly right. In neurology, at least there are two cases, what you call the akinetic mutism. In many aspects, it's something like that. And the other thing is that you have a strange syndrome called loss of psychic autoactivation. I don't know what you call it, perte d'autoactivation psychique. Usually after bilateral lesion of the striatum, and you can have patients like that. I mean, just behave. They are aware of the situation, but they cannot induce any willful behavior. And that's very. Maybe you have some comments, Nikon.
I just
Can I say something by way? So, but how do we know that some of the vegetative patients who are incapable of demonstrating, that, for example, can't do the imagery task or can't do one of the other tasks, maybe some of those patients really have something like akinetic mutism?
We don't know that. That's why we need a mechanistic model.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
So let me respond to your first. Oh, yes, your first question. Okay, so the Van Gaal, you're right. Of course, I agree. You're right. The Van Gaal thing does require a setting where the person is engaged in a task, but that doesn't. It doesn't show that we can't have unconscious executive function when it isn't like that. Not in that paradigm, but still.
So of course, an absence of result is not a result. But in many situations, when you, for instance, you have only unconscious trials, you cannot observe this kind of effect. I mean, you see that you have the interaction between. It's open to experimentation.
I think it's a complex relationship between, and it's like sometimes tricky to make some links between consciousness research in healthy volunteers and what we have in coma. And at the same time, we have like some prior, or it's we can maybe say most often of the, when you have something that is unconscious process, it's weak and it's transient, right? And so that's one of the main assumptions we have when we say
it's weak and it's what?
Transient, short. Like, and that's one of the things we use, for example, in the tennis paradigm, saying you have the instruction, imagine playing tennis. Then you have 30 seconds where there is no stimulation. And the activity continues then, and it's strong and persistent for 30 seconds, even if there is no stimulus. So it's non-reflexive, yeah? But then in some, and so that's something like where even in, and then there's all the validation studies we do, right? And I agree with you, there are some studies showing that you have voluntary processing, like the Heinz research, that is unconscious, but as far as we know, it's weaker and it's more transient. And I would say that what I would like to see is that we have made a lot of progress to see like modular functions, but even high level, like higher order things like executive processing that can be done unconsciously in healthy awake volunteers. But then there's some kind of now, and it was a kind of nice message to hear, you can do that and you can calculate and you can reason unconsciously, but then there must be a difference also in, there must be some kind of function or something that you can do consciously and not unconsciously. And like one hypothesis would be, for example, combining these different functions together. Like you hear the instruction and then you have to desire to do it and then you do it, and like different cognitive functions together. Maybe if that is something where if you need to integrate together, you can only do that consciously. But for now, this is still unclear. You know what I mean? And then for now, it's kind of still, a bit of a question on what kind of brain markers, if we want to use cognitive functions or tasks, what kind of marker is really a good one to say that's conscious or not. But indeed, it's really important to take both into account.
Yeah, actually, Dahan mentions the one you just described. Yeah. That is that one step can be done unconsciously, but two steps in a reasoning or a decision-making seems to require consciousness. So
and so about the akinetic mutism thing, Usually when we look at global brain activity patterns in coma or vegetative state, what we see is just not the pre-SMA that is down, or the basal ganglia, or something more you would see in akinetic mutism. It's more a global, like a widespread dysfunction of the cortex, especially in higher order regions, like frontoparietal regions. And that suggests that actually there's a lot of different functions of your cortex that are impaired, much more than just volition. Now, if you have like the near to normal EEG or PET, then yes, maybe that must be that, but that's not the kind of picture we see usually.
Just real quick, can I just say something? I think this really relates to the first point that I was making, is that we play, maybe we're asking the wrong question. So it's just like the video you showed with the person's hand moving during anesthesia. They were responding reliably, but then they didn't remember after the fact or whatever. So it's not really a question of whether they're conscious or not in that moment, because like Ned said, there's so many things that we can do outside of awareness. And so it's not a question of whether they're possessing that trait of consciousness at the moment, but the question is, what's their potential of getting consciousness at some point? And these measures, whether they're conscious in that moment or not, maybe they're just predictors of whether a person has the capacity to become conscious, rather than asking, are they conscious at that point or not? And how much value we place on that value of being conscious. I mean, let's say it's a brain that can do everything we can do, like you would say, like a zombie brain. It can do everything we can do, just doesn't possess consciousness. Are we value it less?
Yes. Yeah. Let me respond to another of the points you made. Look, it's true that by and large, unconscious states and processes seem to be weaker and more transitory. But there are some cases in the literature of more extended conscious states. I'm thinking of the work of on unconscious working memory, and Claire Sargent's work on unconscious, maybe it's not exactly working memory, but some other kind of memory. And I think what we need in the research on disorders of consciousness and on levels of anesthesia is a better quantification of how long an unconscious process can last at what level. Because if you had that, then you would be able to perhaps rule out the possibility that some of the things going on are unconscious.
I need to So, Dave? No, so, the fact that something is longer lasting or stronger response to stimulation is not a good index of consciousness neither. Like if you take in slow wave sleep, when you have these bistable dynamics, and that's the same with TMS or with stimuli, you can have actually a long lasting and widespread spread of activity in the brain, yeah? You have some fMRI studies that actually you can stimulate the brain and then you have this massive activation too. Right, so we have to be cautious, and that's also always where I'm like, okay, integration and differentiation, there maybe you might find a good job. One modular process to only, maybe not, but if you can combine different cognitive functions together, then you're more like a proxy of integrated information too. But that's where I'm coming from, right? But at the same time, there are some studies showing that just having something long-lasting and strong is not enough. So, but at the same time, even in healthy volunteers, that's the point I wanted to make. We don't really know exactly where the line is. You know what I mean? Thank you. Sorry.
So just to add an additional complexity to your line of inquiry, I wonder if there is a reason for us to think that these unconscious processes can only occur when you already have a conscious system, so that someone has to be conscious even to engage in these unconscious executive functions or something like that. And then, the further question is, to what extent is that possible for a disordered mind, like someone in an MCS?
I think one avenue of evidence for this is processes in very simple animals. As philosophers know from reading Tyler Burge's book that goes into this in some detail, the jumping spider can identify its prey and track its prey through difficult circumstances and then pounce. So if we're willing to just take as at least a tentative hypothesis is not a conscious being, the jumping spider. There's a lot of sophisticated processing that can go on unconsciously.
Why don't we have David?
Also during sleep. There's a recent study during sleep too. Like there's a Quider and Wittgenstein's book that's published in Current Biology like this month. Semantic processing is still going on during sleep and categorization, and that's another set of consciousness too, right? But there's still some higher level processing going on.
But that's a system that is already, I mean, you're talking about a healthy.
Well, but asleep, yeah.
Yeah.
So
But it's a low energy state, so I think it's a fair inference what Melanie's trying to say, that we'd be barking up the wrong tree to imagine that unconscious processes are somehow less robust. Consciousness itself looks like it's the most fragile and the most energy dependent, at least across the inference of our measures today. I think David could present now.
Okay, well, it's been a very rich set of talks at the conference, and there's any number of themes that I could pick up on, but like Ned, I'll just focus on one, and that's the issue of evidence for the presence of consciousness versus evidence for the absence of consciousness. When we talk about detecting or measuring consciousness, you could phrase it, both these questions come up, but the issue is very frequently phrased in terms of, the primary objective here is to find positive evidence for the presence of consciousness in these potentially borderline states, like in patients diagnosed with vegetative states. The question is, well, do we have, positive, fairly conclusive evidence for their being conscious? Or for in anesthesia, the question is phrased very much as, are these patients under anesthesia? Do we have direct positive evidence that, in fact, they are conscious? And the burden of proof is, in general, there's a sense that the burden of proof is on the person that wants to demonstrate and give the case that these people are, in fact, having states of consciousness. But you can, of course, put things the other way around and at least raise the question of, is there positive evidence for thinking these people are not, in fact, conscious? Patients diagnosed with vegetative state, people under anesthesia, and so on. I mean, this is a familiar set of issues that comes up in many domains. I mean, in the case of animal cognition, there's Morgan's canon, which says basically, don't attribute a cognitive state to an animal unless you really need it to explain some stuff. You can possibly get away without attributing the state in an explanatory framework, then do. Attribute the least to the cognitive repertoire that you can get away with doing, and that's being used to put the burden of proof on people who want to establish the presence of a particular cognitive faculty in animals. And of course, it's been very much questioned even in that domain, but I think we can really question whether that's the appropriate attitude to take in this case of human consciousness. But after all, we're dealing with a species, human beings, that we know have the capacity for consciousness. That's not in question. And we're dealing with certain individuals, and we want to know, are they in fact conscious or not? Why should the default hypothesis be that they're not conscious, and that we have to somehow establish that they are conscious? So in Ned's comments just now, he says, yeah, well, look, it could be that all this was going on unconsciously. We might take the attitude, yeah, well, it could be that all that is going on unconsciously, but it could be that it's all going on consciously, and maybe there should be some burden on the person who thinks it's not, that in fact it's not conscious, to establish that. Certainly, for example, for ethical purposes, you might think that, well, if there's any chance that these people diagnosed with vegetative stage are conscious, that really, really matters. And if it's 50-50, it's not spoils to the person who thinks they're not conscious. If it's 50-50, then I take it we ought to, in presence of that uncertainty, we ought to probably treat them as if they are conscious, to be on the safe side, which may make a very big difference to treatment. So I think we really do need to address this question of what is the positive evidence for thinking that people in these different borderline states are not conscious. Now, I mean, it came up in the session this morning on anesthesia, where I guess I asked both speakers if they thought, is all this evidence actually consistent with people under anesthesia having certain background states of consciousness, simple sensory awareness, and so on. And at least these speakers seem to get. For all we know, there is simple consciousness there, even though there's no decisive evidence against that hypothesis. And I take it the same question comes up for patients diagnosed with vegetative state. I mean, we've got all these interesting results we've been hearing about involving some what looks like suggestive positive evidence for the presence of consciousness, in some cases involving, for example, command following and so on. But at the same time, okay, maybe that is positive evidence. What about the other cases where people can't follow commands? Well, of course, you can have consciousness without the capacity to follow commands. So who's to say about all these other cases which don't come up as positives on these cases? You might think it's at least a consistent hypothesis to say there's some minimal amount of consciousness present in all these other patients who come up as negative. And we got some other tests from Adrian today, for example. But the question is quite general. There's a consistent hypothesis that, in fact, most patients diagnosed with a vegetative state have some minimal degree of consciousness, in the sense of phenomenal consciousness, whether it's some minimal degree of sensory awareness or cognitive awareness, whether there's some minimal thing it's like to be them. You might think it's at least a question of considerable ethical importance. I mean, Joe Finns talked yesterday about consciousness as a civil right, which has that can be given many different readings. But you might take it that there's one way to read this is that if there's even a chance that you're conscious, you have to be treated defeasibly under the assumption that in fact you are consciousness, and given the whole swathe of civil rights associated with consciousness, and somehow the presumption of consciousness has to actually be defeated in a human being. At least that's not an unreasonable line. So I'm interested in the question just where the evidence lies. We talked about the case of anesthesia already, but I'm also interested in the case of where the evidence lies in patients diagnosed with vegetative state. There's no conclusive proof of anything about consciousness, but is there pretty convincing evidence that most patients diagnosed with vegetative states, the ones that come up negative on these tests, in fact have no degree of consciousness, or is everything we know pretty well consistent with the view there is some minimal degree of consciousness there? I'm at least very interested in where people think the scientific evidence lies on that. And there are questions about what the ethical consequences should be. Just say it turns out that most patients diagnosed with a vegetative state, in fact, have some minimal degree of consciousness. I mean, I guess the question will come up as whether it's a category mistake then to say they have vegetative state, because conscious vegetative state is a contradiction. But there's also the question of what that means ethically. I mean, you might think, the first pass reaction is, well, if there's some degree of consciousness there, even if it's some minimal degree of, say, a background sensory experience or some background phenomenological hum, then somehow they're in the charm circle and they ought to be treated with all the civil rights. But I mean, it's not obvious that this is the only attitude to take. You might take the view that, well, it turns out that consciousness is not actually the important thing ethically, and having some minimal degree of consciousness doesn't necessarily get you into the charm circle of civil and ethical rights any more than being a worm or a mouse with some minimal degree of consciousness does that. I mean, this issue comes up quite often in discussion of the ethics of consciousness. I used to take the view that I shouldn't eat anything that was conscious, or one's been conscious, or had the capacity for consciousness. And then I became sympathetic with panpsychism, the view that everything has some degree of consciousness. And I found I was going to go very hungry. So around that point, you end up revising there's a pressure to revise your ethical views. If consciousness is that widespread, then it may turn out that what matters ethically isn't so much consciousness, but the kind of consciousness, the character of consciousness, the complexity of consciousness. So on a different scale, something that, it's at least possible something like this could happen here. If it turns out there is consciousness in this very widespread way throughout, patients of these kinds, and so one possible attitude might be to say, well, it turns out that just the presence or absence of phenomenal consciousness is not the ethically determinative thing, but something else, such as the kind or character or complexity of the consciousness or associated cognitive capacities. Anyway, I don't have the answers to any of those questions, but curious to hear what people think.
I completely agree with that, and but one interesting thing is that this doesn't speak to the ethical issue, but it does speak to a value issue, which is, how would one feel if one's loved one, say a child or a spouse, was in an accident in a vegetative state, and compare two cases where the person could be kept alive on a ventilator, but would look like those empty brain things we saw, and the other case is a strong activation, as we saw in a number of the images of sensory cortices that plausibly underlies some kind of sensory consciousness. I know personally, I'd go for keeping the loved one alive if there's a lot of sensory consciousness.
If there's just a bit.
But,
If there's just a bit.
oh, okay, that's a little more difficult.
If I'll try to be brief. So basically, when we deal with consciousness and approaching consciousness in patients with severe brain damage, we're kind of faced to a paradoxical question, because consciousness is a first-person subjective experience, and then we have to gauge if some other people than us are, right? And there I found what Tim Bain was saying about the natural kind approach or pre-theoretical approach relevant. Like what you can do is to try to find some good markers maybe of what you expect someone to be able to do if it's conscious. And I think the most widely accepted would be to be able to give a report, right? And to me, able to give a report or communicate or a reproducible comment following are kind of linked, because if you have a reproducible response to comment, then you're able to say yes or no to questions. So that's one thing, and that's where maybe like tennis and other things can be useful. But then in the ones where it's negative, then you're kind of faced with more debate about what would be a good marker or not. And I think what we try to do is, and what most groups are trying to do is then trying to interpret the brain activity patterns you have in comparing them to sleep or anesthesia and other conditions where people can give a report, and compare if you have something same or different. But at the end, maybe the safest bet, if it's a long-term one, is trying to develop a theory, like also several groups try to do, to address, coming back to first-person subjective experience and try to find what are the mechanisms of consciousness and try to go then, to see if there is such kind of properties in the brain of these patients. But that's a longer-term approach, and we're not there yet in any groups, right? So what we do now is maybe more comparing, trying to still interpret what kind of brain activity is likely there or not by comparing to sleep or anesthesia, for example. But that's still not completely answering the question.
So I think that the report paradigm is a good instance of this, because I think it's true that the presence of report is pretty good evidence for the presence of consciousness. But is the absence of report good evidence for the absence of consciousness?
No.
Well, we know that there are lots and lots of things. Of course,
No,
there are all kinds of non-verbal animals. We know there's experiences under sleep and so on.
But
No
then you need a
report,
theory.
no consciousness.
I
Well, okay.
do.
So one thing to go through is a theory, but there are questions of how to ground the data of the theory. Of course, IoT. IoT predicts, of course, that vast numbers of these systems are going to in fact be conscious.
So I was just going to ask and clarify this question a little bit afterwards. I'm not sure what kind of evidence you'd be looking for the absence of consciousness. So there are two kinds of evidence I can imagine when it comes to consciousness study that come clearly to mind. But the first just comes from normal when you're studying things in the world. You look for effects of things that you can't observe yourself. And consciousness is one thing I can't observe in you, right? So you look for effects. And this would be like things like behavior in consciousness studies. The other things that we can look for is after coming up with neural correlates of consciousness, which typically requires behavior, right? You have neural correlates for consciousness, right? But the problem I feel like is you can't really have any effects from an unconscious person, right? And you can't really get neural correlates, most likely, either, for unconsciousness, because you can always imagine that whatever correlates you find, you can imagine that there is some conscious state to these correlates, right? So I feel like the default view might have to be for positive evidence, just because I'm not quite sure what evidence for absence of consciousness would be.
Well, you might.
So this is more of a question of, I don't know too much about this.
You might think that there are some processes we've got pretty good reasons to believe, or at least are unconscious in us, such as deep brain processing, unconscious rules of language, and all the things that get appealed to in computational cognitive science, which at least we don't see any introspective evidence for in our own consciousness. So they at least seem to be unconscious for us. Of course, there's always the possibility that they're conscious for somebody else. Or for some other system. So you might think that's, for example, one way to get evidence of where there is unconscious processing. There's, at least for us, some of the time when we are conscious, not everything is in our consciousness. So if stuff is relevantly like the unconscious processes in us, that would be positive evidence for not being conscious. Just one kind, maybe.
Well, I think there's an answer. dead brain. The empty skull sign that we showed in Stephen's talk, in my talk, is the loss of the organ. Now, we have to agree that human consciousness, as we understand it, is incompatible with the lack of any brain cells. If we can't agree on that, then all bets are off. No, I mean, and then it becomes, no, but there is, no, I
Talk
mean,
to
but
Deepak
in terms of operationalizing this discussion, right? I mean, who knows, that might be completely fine, but then we're not talking about, now we're in different categories. It's not even a category error, we're just not even talking about the same stuff, okay? So if we're talking about a brain, the human brain, how consciousness arises in the human brain, and we can work our way up from the dead brain, which we all agree, accordingly to the survey here, is not conscious, right? So if we go back to Jeanette and Plum, because you have to understand how the concept evolved. So the idea of a vegetative state came out of Walter Cannon's ideas about the vegetative nervous system, which was distinguished as the nervous system that wasn't involved in cognitive activity, that organized cardiopulmonary regulatory processes and other autonomic processes and could form, and Cannon did these sublation experiments where he cut off the forebrain, et cetera, it could form a well-organized system where the brainstem ran the spinal cord and regulated it. And that became the operational definition of a vegetative nervous system. So the concept of a vegetative state was a injury to the brain, death above the level of the brainstem. And so there was a fixed idealized model, right? The idealized model was all the cells above the brainstem are dead. Now that's not a typical lesion, but there are, approximations of it. And so we get, Cliff Safer and I, who took over the, editing with Terry Posner of Stupor and Coma, which was the book that made the picture appearance earlier in the conference, had a long discussion about this, and we kind of went back and forth. So again, we should insist that the vegetative state is a flat zero. And in my mind, I think that's actually the right way to go eventually, because I think that's the only way to make sense of the concept, so that we have operational criteria that predict autopsy results that everybody would agree, just as much as everybody in the room here agrees that brain death is not consistent with consciousness. Autopsy results where there's enough damage above the brainstem that, as we understand consciousness as a phenomenon of the corticothalamic system, corticothalamic system, that it's not possible. Now that's a more complicated discussion to have, and it's one that's beyond the knowledge base of probably about 6 people in the room. But the point is that that's the answer.
Well,
and then above that, then it's ambiguous. I mean, it's complicated.
Of course, I think there are 2 natural places where one might question whether that evidence is decisive. I mean, the first is going to be the question of the model.
Right.
Consciousness is only this thing about the
Right.
about the brainstem. I mean, what is our evidence for that? It's like we've got fairly primitive models at the moment. But second, there's also the worry, which I think you alluded to, which is that most actual cases of vegetative states, they're not. They're only at best very weak approximations to that ideal. There's nothing going on above the brainstem. And I take it in a lot of cases there's quite a lot going on about the brainstem. Who's to say whether that residual consciousness
I
is
think
going to go along with
I
something?
think Melanie would say that her data show a pretty sharp distinction between vegetative state and minimally conscious state, and Marcello's data show a pretty sharp distinction. And I think
we can agree there's a sharp distinction between those 2 things. The question is that distinction between conscious people and unconscious people?
Well,
That's a further question.
Why we think it's likely, it's not certain, but it's likely, is because it's very comparable then to brain function during deep sleep with no report and deep anesthesia.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes us feel that even if there are things still like a response, like a slow wave response, it's not nothing, it's a slow wave response to TMS, or like there is some metabolism that is decreased by half, so it's not nothing. But it's very comparable to what you find in deep sleep and anesthesia. And then it becomes much more likely that there is no consciousness there.
Okay, so that's some positive evidence. I like the style of argument. Of course, someone wanted to take this line. We've got nothing to exclude the possibility that some consciousness in deep sleep and deep anesthesia.
Sure, but it's not likely that it's...
But it's
I agree. It's probably not very rich consciousness.
But it's also worse than that, right? And we haven't talked about the ugly 4th dimension very much in this conference. But the 4th dimension is time, right? Because the 4th dimension says, how do we predict somebody who clearly is in vegetative state by every possible measure that we have and has a seriously damaged brain, really can't recover? And you know what? We don't have that answer.
Can I just make a comment too? I mean, one question that I've been asking just for myself is, if God forbid something happens to me, would I rather be in an unconscious state alive with the potential to regain consciousness, or unconscious and dead, right, with no potentiality. So that's the reason why I keep sort of harping on this issue, is instead of looking at is that being experiencing consciousness, whether it's gradated or not, in that moment, is not the question to be asking, but the question is how much potential is there to regain consciousness? Because that's the question we're asking in terms of whether we should keep this person alive or not in that state. And the question is, and a lot of your work, Nico, goes to this, is the substrate there with the potential to regain consciousness? And you might get little glimpses of it while they're still in that, coma state. But so we should maybe be looking at ways to measure that, the potentiality, because that would be my question, if I'm in that state, is what's the potential? Because if someone cuts me off, there's no going back, right? So I want to know for sure, and that's what we should be looking at in terms of the gradation of potential for consciousness.
Right, and the reversal starts that process on the other end. If we have lots and lots of cells that aren't dead, but are dysfunctional, we better know that they're permanently dysfunctional.
Yeah. And there's neurogenesis, and
We don't know the answer to that question, and the way I've gotten burned in my own clinical work in the recent past is by making the wrong assumptions about that. Okay, if I get burned badly, other people are.
I'd rather
You
have
mean
that,
about time?
I'd rather have that potential for consciousness as long as it actually gets fulfilled and turns into actual consciousness. If
But at
mere
least there's the
consciousness
potential.
never gets fulfilled, then I'm not sure what value there is in that.
I just wanted to tell you, David, just three basic things. First, I completely agree with Nico, and I think the only utility of neurology is this story. I tried also to present, because otherwise, before this story, you could perfectly imagine that a foot is conscious, etc. So the fact that you have this long-lasting story about where it happened, for us it seems like, okay, it's obvious, but it's not obvious at all. So I think everyone has to pay attention to that. I agree with your discussion. The second point is that I think also regarding Tim, and I appreciated a lot the last two talks also, but again, the deflationist view, I think the inflationist view, neither, my immediate intuition is that it can be very generous from a personal point of view, but in a way, many times when you are very inflationist, it's like politically correct, but in the sense you attribute the function to anyone, but in the end you keep exactly the same problem, because when you will, it's like the Jaws where it's okay, there is no racism, there is no difference between black and white, everyone is blue, but the light blues come the first into the bus. So if you mean, this joke? No? So what I mean is that if you attribute consciousness to everyone, you play the game as if you were attributing consciousness to everyone, most probably you will still keep a distinction that will be blind off, and so I think we have to make the effort to try to find these positive signs. When we can try to find them, we give the more effective therapeutics that we can, but the reverse is not also, it's very, my last point is that for me it's very independent, the diagnosis of consciousness and the ethical consideration. That is to say, it's not because you are in the vegetative state, that then you do not deserve any care, that you have to be, so this notion, I think it's important, that also to your point, Sid, yesterday, that we saw yesterday in the two talks of ethics, the promotion of consciousness, I think it's important, because if you are a patient and you know that you can play tennis and no one knows it, and someone allows you to know that you can do it, and so maybe you can increase your ability to be autonomous, that's a very good point. None of us would like not to be considered this way, so I think it's important. But the reverse is that if we promote consciousness very positively, the risk is that you decrease the processing of the care we would provide to the VS patient. So I think the distinction is not like everyone is conscious, is that being conscious or not is one objective to achieve, and the care of the patient is another objective which is completely orthogonal, to my mind.
So you guys both talk about the history and the standard model, and this is what's required for consciousness. This does very much interact with the question of what's actually meant by consciousness, and it's not obvious to me, at least, that in the theorists developing these models necessarily had what exactly they had in mind when they said, this is what's required for consciousness. Did they mean phenomenal consciousness in the sense that, or did they mean maybe, for example, something that was a bit more demanding, like
the cognitive sapient state, right?
The which?
I think the theorists in this case were Jen and Plum.
Yeah.
And Plum's testimony in the Supreme Court that Joe showed yesterday was the ability to recover the cognitive sapient state. It was a high level.
Cognitive sapient sounds like a pretty high bar.
Yeah.
High bar.
Because they claim that, for example, processes above the brainstem are required for a cognitive sapient state. It's consistent. with them not being required for some more minimal kind of conscious state.
But I think from an operational point of view, in medicine, the distinction between panpsychist ideas about some element of consciousness being reserved within a brainstem are relevant to the discourse, and they're not irrelevant to our overall discourse, but they're relevant to the operational concerns of decision making.
I think we just got to figure out what are the operational concerns. I mean, if we're trying to detect the presence of, as you call it, the cognitive sapient state, then we've got to think about, okay, what do we actually care about? Are we
So this is part of
detecting the presence of cognition is one thing, detecting the presence of.
I think Joe's project gives us the best light on this, and because the patients themselves are not giving us their proxy, the surrogates are, and part of it is to be able to demonstrate some kind of communication, or in principle over time be able to do that, and.
Communication is not something we care about intrinsically. Communication is a means to an end.
Well, no, but I think people do make decisions based on whether somebody has any capacity or will have the capacity to feel pain or to communicate, and those are the two cut points. And I think if somebody can feel pain but can't communicate, that tends to make surrogates go toward thinking about whether this is.
By the way, does pain count as a cognitive sapient state in this taxonomy, or is it something lower than it?
I think that's a fair question, but I think that representational states don't have a lot of evidence as being attached to brain function without the corticothalamic system. I don't know of any evidence, and I don't think any. I mean, we take a show of hands of any neurologists believe that if you don't have a corticothalamic system, that you could experience.
Mark Soames has a whole paper on the conscious id, where he believes that the entire brain. Well, yeah.
But evidence,
yeah.
not belief.
Yeah. Also,
Not my belief.
The study on quality of life in locked-in syndrome was pretty much showing that the main determinant if they were rating high quality of life or not was the ability to communicate with family. So that's also like an argument saying the ability to communicate is something that we care about.
From the inside of the patient.
Yeah, from the
That's
inside,
right.
from their
Yeah, so it's both ways. We have a question for that. I think we got to get Matt up here, otherwise you're.
Yeah, why don't you ask your question? Okay, so I have a methodological question. So it seems like we're all in agreement that the way we proceed here, and this is kind of following what Tim said earlier, is we have easy cases where we all just agree intuitively that healthy humans generally have consciousness, and that dead brains don't have consciousness, and I think some of us agree that jumping spiders don't have consciousness. And then we proceed by analog from there, along anatomy and behavior to the difficult cases. It seems like we have no choice but to do that, right? For any given case, if you want to, for the easy cases, if you want to question whether or not that thing has consciousness, the only way you're going to answer that question is by behavioral anatomic analog to something else that we all agree does have consciousness.
So
there has to be some stopping point. There has to be some intuitive stopping point. What I'm wondering about is those intuitive stopping points, the ones we all agree on. That seems likely to be culture bound.
Well, I think
so if you imagine that if we're coming from an animist background where things like the wind and rivers are just accepted intuitively to have some sort of mind to them, then we probably have very different answers when we start following behavioral and I guess anatomic analogs to work out the difficult cases. So now when we're thinking about PVS patients, I'm wondering if it's something to be concerned about, that the easy cases we're using to guide our reasoning about these difficult cases are probably fairly contingent, they're probably cultural bound, they're given a certain point in cultural and historical development, and I'm not sure there's any way out of this problem, but it seems like a worrisome basis on which to make these decisions that really make a difference to human beings.
I have an answer to that. I think that actually the way out, the answer is the way out is science, and I think there is going to be a mechanistic model here, and I don't think that it's unreasonable to follow out the existing science to get a hint of the outline of what that mechanism and that model looks like, because at least in a lawful way, we understand how sensory information comes into the brain and gets represented. And even on the front end, we know that there are requirements in the coding of that information and the firing properties of the neurons, say in the visual cortex, and how that information comes together. And we know that some things are certainly not present under deep anesthesia. If anybody's ever tried to do a single unit recording in V1, and the anesthesia drops a little bit too much, you will find out that you won't get anything. Those cells will not pick up even a drifting grating. Okay, so there are lawful, not just contingent, but mechanistic things about a representational world starting to get instantiated in a central nervous system.
So,
and I think that that can be built up from the ground.
I'm not challenging the causal laws that would constitute the kinds of behavioral and anatomical analogs I was pointing at. I'm challenging that our intuitions about the stable starting points, the things that we all just agree, this is a conscious thing, and this is the thing that we'll build our science on. Our science of consciousness will come from looking at the mechanistic analogs to this thing.
If we
It's
can't,
the
right.
starting points that I'm raising the question about.
So, I mean, I would think the starting points are that consciousness is a brain process, and that consciousness, as we understand or are talking about it in this context, is an emergent property of neurons. If we can't agree on that, then we really can't go very far. I agree with that.
My starting point is, I think I'm conscious, and maybe you too.
We have one last presentation, and then we can open it up for a total free-for-all.
Good. I've been wanting to jump in on the ethics discussion. I mean, this sort of, I think I'm going to end up in the same place as Heather, actually. But some people think that there's a big ethical difference between PBS patients and people in minimally conscious states. So why is that? So they think that, with PBS patients, you can maybe let them die if they're not already dead, and you can harvest their organs. With MCS patients, people tend to think, no, you can't harvest their organs. They're, at least minimally conscious. And one of the rationale is just that they think that consciousness is a necessary condition for right holding or personhood or something of that sort, right? So if an individual is not conscious, then that individual cannot be a right holder or person, etc. And so by that argument, PBS patients are not conscious, so they're not right holders, whereas MCS patients are. Now elsewhere, and Gina sort of asked about this yesterday, and so I have my own views about that. I mean, elsewhere I've argued that you actually don't need to have consciousness in order to be a rights holder. I defended a view, what I call the genetic basis for moral agency account of right holding. And on that view, even the VS patients can be rights holders. So that PBS patients, people in coma, et cetera, they can all be rights holders. Does that mean, what does that mean ethically? Does that mean that we can't therefore harvest their organs, let them die, et cetera, et cetera? And so I'll come to that shortly, but I want to sort of draw a parallel with the brain death, what Nico was talking about. So there's a parallel debate here with brain death, sort of whole brain death, right? So some people think that if an individual is brain dead, then that individual is dead. And so they think that people sort of with whole brain death are brain dead, and therefore they're dead. But not everybody thinks this, right? So, some people think that if you can if they can have you can somehow keep them breathing, et cetera, then these individuals are not dead. And I share this view. I think that brain death is not death. I think that if an individual retains certain organismic functioning of the various life processes, respiration, self-division, et cetera, then that individual is not really dead. So now, with respect to this debate, some people are upfront that when they the reason for defining brain death is for pragmatic reasons. Basically, they want to sort of harvest the organs, et cetera. And we have this dead donor rule, which says that you can't harvest the organs until they're dead. And so there's this redefinition of death as brain death, right? And so you might think that something similar is going on here with consciousness, the PBS patients, right? So if somehow it's necessary for rights holding, then we can't take their organs. So somehow we have to define, some people think that, somehow maybe we have to redefine, consciousness, or think that, these individuals who are not conscious, they're not rights holder. Somehow we have to make it the case so that we can sort of harvest their organs. So how can it be permissible then let's say I'm right, that all these people are actually rights holders, then how can we go about harvesting their organs then? Or let them die, et cetera, et cetera. So one possibility is in terms of quality of life, and Sid was talking about this yesterday. Some people think that if an individual has very low quality of life, then supposing that, subject to informed consent from the individual, maybe sort of advanced directives or or maybe by proxy to the families, then it may be permissible to let the individual die and then maybe possibly harvest the person's organs, right? The problem here is that how do you go about determining whether someone has a low quality of life, right? So a common way is to ask for subjective reports of their subjective levels of well-being, right? So we saw yesterday there's a scale of -5 to +5, where -5 is very low well-being or happiness, and +5 is very high well-being, and you ask people, how would you rate your well-being? There are two possible problems with the subjective reports. So one is it's the suicidal teenager, right? So someone who sort of, the teenager who's rejected by his first crush, and wants to just, thinks that life is not worth living, wants to just, wants to die. We don't think that we therefore should, agree with him and sort of let the teenager die. Right? So if we only go by subjective levels of well-being, we think, well, then maybe it's okay to let him die, but that doesn't seem quite right. And then the other thing is that we've seen that people adapt. They have adaptive preferences. So even individuals in locked-in syndrome, they adapt, right? So we saw studies yesterday where even though they're in locked-in syndromes, they report they're pretty happy, or they're closer to normal, right? And so that seems to be there's an issue about that. So here's what I suggest, and this is actually complementary to the subjective level, the quality of life method. And so what I suggest is that we look at what I call fundamental capacities. And so elsewhere, I've sort of argued that human beings have what I call they have human rights to what I call the fundamental conditions for pursuing a good life. And one of the fundamental, some of the fundamental conditions are the fundamental capacities for pursuing a good life. And what are those? Those are capacities that all human beings, qua human beings, require, whatever they qua individuals may require in order to pursue a good life. So some of them they include things like the capacity to think, the capacity to be motivated by facts, to know, to choose and act freely, to appreciate the worth of something, to develop interpersonal relationships, and to have control over the direction of one's life. So the proposal here is something like this. If an individual lacks nearly all the fundamental capacities, then supposing that proper informed consent has been obtained, from the individual and or the individual's family, then it may be permissible to let the individual die. And then we can talk about sort of harvesting organs, et cetera, et cetera. So what does this theory tell us? Well, with respect to the suicidal teenager, it tells us that this teenager has all the fundamental capacities. We shouldn't agree to let this teenager die, despite the subjective sort of report. Now, with respect to patients in locked-in syndrome, that's a bit of they're borderline cases in ethics, and so that might be one of those borderline cases where these patients have lost significant abilities to act, but they may still they still have some abilities to communicate, to develop interpersonal relationships, et cetera, et cetera. So that presents a really difficult sort of borderline case, and maybe this is why it's complementary to a sort of a quality of life approach where the subjective reports might become relevant. Now, but what about patients in PBS and MCS? Well, this approach says that it depends on whether this individual will regain many of their fundamental capacities. And this is what Heather was talking about the potentiality. So, and a really relevant fact here for me is that a number of the MCS patients do recover. And neuroimaging, I think, can be really helpful here in helping us figure out the neural correlates to figure out whether these individuals, who's going to recover and how, et cetera, et cetera. But there's going to be some individuals who are never going to recover, right? You can, it may be helpful to have a category here, sort of the permanent or persistent MCS, right? And so these are individuals who have intermittent and not sustained consciousness. So someone used a metaphor yesterday about light bulbs. So imagine a sort of a light bulb that just sort of keeps flickering, and that's it. It sort of goes on and off, but it cannot sustain itself. In these cases, their capacities to pursue the basic activities would be very, very attenuated. And it seems to me that, suppose some kind of informed consent has been obtained from the individual and or the individual's family, then it may be okay to let these individuals go, even if they have consciousness. So, so I'm on the side of those people who think that it's not all just about consciousness. There's something about maybe the quality of life. I mean, so I agree with Sid that, and also Joe, that we should try to help individuals regain their fundamental capacities. I will be more specific. Basically, our aim should be to try to help them recover their fundamental capacities. But there are going to be some individuals who can't and who can never do that. In those cases, I think we have to be upfront. We need a public discussion that even though they're conscious, it's okay to let them go. Just like it's okay to, replace the light bulb, sort of let the light bulb go. I don't like that metaphor, actually. I think it's very depressing. But, it's okay to let that go if it's going to be the case that the light is sort of intermittent and not sustainable. Thank you.
Well, there's one thing that we didn't really talk about is that there's a lot of progress now made in brain-computer interfaces, and if you detect someone is conscious, then actually you can potentially give them much better quality of life than a few years before, because we have all these techniques now to have them unlock themselves, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's something also to take into account.
Yeah.
But that's like not in the case where the light bulb is, like you need some kind of level of consciousness to sustain that potentially. But that's something to think about too.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
you can ask them if they want to go on.
No, that's right. That's right. So it might be. I think Sid talked about environmental enhancement, and that's what like BCI might be one of the things. The brain-computer interface might be one of the ways by which we can really enhance the quality of life of these individuals. You can imagine that these individuals, they can hook up directly to the internet, and they can go into Second Life and make all their purchases and do all sorts of things, kind of like Stephen Hawking. I mean, that might not be such a bad life, So I think part of the limitation is environmental for some of these people, but so those people, maybe we can augment their environment such that they can still have a decent quality of life. And to be able to sort of, engage, make use, exercise of their fundamental capacities. But there are going to be some individuals who are going to have these intermittent. They're just sort of on, off, and you don't know. It might take 48 hours. I think you mentioned the 48 hours, and then every 48 hours they utter a word. It's just, there you want to ask, is that really worth it? Even if there is consciousness.
Yeah. So my question is actually about, what if you use the interface and then the person tells you that they don't really want to continue living? And the reason I ask this is because there is actually evidence from individuals with high spinal cord injury that they actually want to die immediately after, but then it takes a really long time and they might turn around and say, I really like my quality of life.
Yeah.
And now it's slightly different than the teenager because, in the teenager you have established, maybe even one can say effective treatments for depression. You can prevent them, and the limits to their liberty could be minimal. It's limited in time. It might not really require continued hospitalization and people doing to them things that they don't really want for a really, really long time. But here, what you're proposing is that, well, I don't know if you're proposing. I'm going to ask you whether you're proposing it, right?
Yeah.
So my question is, what is it? What happens if you actually, let's say, have evidence that if you maintain somebody in these minimally conscious states and over time they might actually improve in quality of life and reports of quality of life, but immediately after the injury somehow, if they still can communicate, they tell you that they want to die. How do you make decisions about that?
Great. That's a great question. So my view on that is, well, generally I support a right to die. And the way the theory, I think the theory gives you a nice way of figuring that out. There's going to be some sort of vagueness, but basically the idea is that when you're starting to lose out on some of your major fundamental capacities, and the more you lack a certain fundamental capacity, the more claim you have to a right to die. And so once you dip below certain, that's a way of assessing the claims. the right to die. So for the so if you're sort of quadriplegic, I think that even though you're fully conscious and you could do all sorts of different things, maybe you don't want to live in that state. And I think that there's a good case to be made that maybe we should respect your wishes. And so the idea here is to be able to live the life that you want to live and sort of live it in a dignified way. And so if you if you don't have these fundamental capacities, you can't really live the life the way you want to live. So.
Can I just ask can you just repeat what those fundamental capacities were that you said?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's there are things that include the capacity to think, to be motivated by facts, to know, to choose and act freely, to be able to develop deep personal relationships with other people, and to have control over the direction of one's life. There could be others. It's not meant to be exhaustive.
I guess I just wanted to make a note of that, and also what you had said before about how the ability to communicate is a key thing, because like for me, the reason I got interested in consciousness research was a fear of death, and I had a thought as a very young kid, well, I don't mind if my body doesn't exist or I can't communicate with people as long as I could still have my inner dialogue, right? And so I'm kind of envisioning this person or whatnot being there, not being able to communicate, not being able to engage in decision making maybe, or any of these kind of complex things. But I guess maybe you'd put this under the category of think, but or even just experience. So if it's almost like you're just there in an almost dreamlike state, having surreal experiences or taking in some information, or maybe it's just like watching a movie for eternity. At least that's something, at least in my mind, rather than nothing. So it's important to understand what values people place on these, what you're claiming to be these fundamental capacities. And some people might think, I still want to experience something rather than nothing, even if it's just seeing various colors or hearing music, and that's all it is.
Sure. So those would be, so once you dip below that threshold where you're missing some of the fundamental capacities, but you still got some of them, then we're in these borderline areas where maybe subjective reports are important, maybe sort of advanced directives are important, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's a really tough area. But what's clear is if you don't have any of the fundamental capacities, you could still be alive, but it's okay to let you go. And if you just can't have any sustained activities, maybe it's okay to let you go. But if you're above it, then it's not okay to let you go, even if you want to go. So.
So one of the things I wanted to clarify here was that you use this example of the depressed teenager.
Yeah.
And we could make that a different example of perhaps someone who's chronically, clinically depressed, who at some point contemplates suicide and perhaps succeeds. And the difference there is that there's a case where we are considering stopping someone from ending their own life. And the difference between that and the case of someone with a disorder of consciousness is that we're going to take an action, withdraw life support from that person or something. And I guess what I want you to comment on is one of your fundamental capacities is the freedom to choose and make decisions about what you want to do.
Yeah.
So how do we square that with preventing someone from taking their own life?
Good. So so it's the capacity to choose rather than what you actually choose. So what I care about is sort of your internal capacities, right? Do you have the capacity to choose? But in the case of in a nutshell, it's meant to be sort of a quasi-objectivist account, right? And but if you are mobile, and you're depressed, there's nobody can really stop you if you really want to, commit suicide. That's just sort of, if you can move and do things. And so the tricky part comes when you can't do those things, but then you're already missing some of the fundamental capacities, such as the capacity to act, right?
But hasn't someone who's got an advanced directive saying, if I'm in a vegetative state for 12 months, I want you to withdraw life support?
Yeah.
Or their proxies know that this is what they want. Haven't they already made that choice for themselves, at which point, what does it matter if they're lacking any capacities at all?
So the example, so the advanced directive, I think Joe's not here. So Joe talked about how broad the sort of the advanced directives are. And here's one of the problems is that people change their minds. They have adaptive preferences. They say, you know, if I'm in a demented state, then please, you know, just let me go. Don't give me antibiotics if I get sick, right? But when they get to sort of in that state, they actually still retain some fundamental capacity. So, for example, they can enjoy, they're in old age homes, but they can enjoy relationships with their neighbors, right? Or they can enjoy watching sort of TV. You know, they get upset, visibly upset. I mean, there's sort of reports of this. They get visibly upset when you shut that, you know, when you shut off the TV, right? And so there, it seems like if they can still, they still retain certain capacities, and it seems like they still care about certain things. And then you might think that, well, even though they don't have the capacity to decide things, something has changed. And you know, maybe we don't want to go completely with what was decided in the advanced directive. And that's part of the problem with the advanced directives. So
maybe we have one question.
Yeah.
Mike, and then you get a bunch.
Hi, okay, so I have two questions, but I think they're probably going to be short answers. So how would you measure the potentiality for improving the quality of life, that is, having the fundamental capacities that you mentioned? And the second question has to do with those people that are not ill, but actually have low fundamental capacities, or lacking one of those fundamental capacities. How do you measure that, or where does that fit into your picture of a comparison, let's say, with those that are ill, that are willing to die?
yeah, so people who lack some fundamental capacities can still have a decent, can still have a good life. And so we should try to do whatever we can to sort of, like some people with sort of maybe sort of cognitive deficiency, they might still be able to have very rich depersonal relationships and things like that. And so just because they lack some, that doesn't mean that they couldn't have sort of good quality of life. So that's what I would say about that. In terms of the fundamental capacities, it's not it's not about guaranteeing that you have a good quality of life. We can't do that. We can't guarantee, things happen, people get diseases, et cetera, et cetera. What we can do is to try to help you make sure that you develop your fundamental capacities, to develop your internal capacities, and make sure that certain environments are set up such that you can exercise those things. But we can't guarantee that you'll have a good life. I mean, that's not something that we can do as a matter of public policy.
On the issue of advanced directives, I'm reminded of a study of people who had jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and lived. It's an interesting thing because it turns out there are considerable numbers of them, surprisingly. But it is a very final thing to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge. Every single one of these people who was interviewed, I think they interviewed all the living ones, said that after they jumped, they'd regretted it. They changed their mind, every single one of them, on the way down.
Yeah.
So just with regard to what you've been talking about yesterday, John mentioned this movie, Habla con ella, or Talk with Her, and I think there's this other really interesting movie for the other side of the coin, which is Mar Adentro, The Sea Within, which is exactly a quadriplegic and his right to die. It's a really marvelous movie with Bardem. But I wanted to see when you say that it's time to open for everyone, or if we're still just dealing with this particular.
I think we can just go for it, because we have about 15 minutes.
Because I think 15 minutes. Yes, so 15 minutes ago or so we were going to the issue of definition, which I really wanted to bring back if possible. Because there's two radically different starting points. The one that Nick was mentioning, the one that you were mentioning, David, or if not radically different, very, very different. And I think that a lot of the talks and a lot of the conclusions and a lot of the discussion really still surrounds the issue of definition, right? With Tim before, I don't know where Tim is, but we were talking a little bit about attention before, and a lot of the issues that have been in the literature is because for a long time, it was a very ill-defined concept. it's still not perfectly defined, but at least in some literature, like in visual attention, it's advanced a lot. And a lot has been because the definition has been clarified, there's operational definitions, there's much more context across different levels of analysis, and so forth. So I was wondering if this is open to everyone in the panel, or everyone that has participated, but if we could go back a little bit to the issue of definition.
So this certainly has been a, I think it's certainly the case with the word consciousness. It means a million different things, and this poses all
What would be the
all
working
kinds of
definition when you
ambiguities.
organize this conference? So
Well,
is there something common?
But at least among philosophers, there's been some regimentation given to this in recent years, especially by the chap on my left, who's been actually put forward. The trouble is, everyone makes distinctions, but it's hard to get a distinction to catch on. But Ned's actually been pretty successful in getting certain distinctions to catch on, like that between phenomenal consciousness, access consciousness, reflective consciousness, and so on. And I think it's gotten to the point where most of the time, at least for philosophers, when they say consciousness, that without any qualification, the default is phenomenal consciousness. There's something it's like, and some people think there's still some ambiguities left there, but at least I think there's a fair degree of consensus. They're latching on to a common thing, which they're disagreeing about. Now, that said,
with state of consciousness,
it's not as obvious to me whether there's the same. Obviously the sociology of neurology is quite different from the sociology of philosophy, and there's probably different notions floating around there, and I don't know what the influential regimentations have been.
Well, I mean, our definitions are operational. Our definitions are operational, and they're used in the community, and they're metrical. I mean, we have, we assign diagnoses based on specific criteria that have operational guidelines as to how to make a determination as to whether somebody gets a score of 1, 2, 3, or 5, or a yes or a no on a particular behavior, and those operational definitions are cut points for these disorders of consciousness that we've been talking about. But actually, we don't actually have very much to say about how to define consciousness within the normative range of consciousness, which is, I think, as Tim is not here, but talked about, is modal. I mean, there's all sorts of ways in which you can put together a normal consciousness that could have almost no correspondence to another one, and on some levels, and on other levels, maybe not. That's not our issue in our puzzle box.
But if it is operational, then the 40% inaccuracy rate that was mentioned yesterday is quite surprising, right? If 50% is chance, and we're at 40%.
But so my point was in my talk, that's what happened in brain death when we realized that we needed an apnea test. Okay, so my point is, yes, all of these data, whether they're sensitive or not, point us to the fact that the behavioral criteria, even in the context of a reasonable history underlying a vegetative state, really do require some additional measures, and probably a first measure that then leads to many more, and that's how it's going to evolve, just like brain death did. Melanie has a follow-up.
Yeah.
You want this?
That's the same kind of dissociation between, like consciousness being a first-person experience, and you can define it as such, and then the problem we have of trying to go to if the patients are conscious or not from external point of view, right? So the definitions we have, I would, like the definition I would agree with for first-person experience, like consciousness would be what disappears during dreamless sleep. But that's the phenomenal definition. And then when you go with patients, then you have to have like an operational or what you're, like a natural kind, like a functional way to define it. And then that's in the behavior you can find it. And there, the criteria we have, well, if you can functionally communicate or use your objects, we don't have much doubt you have high level, your exit of minimally conscious. And then, I think it was you presented in a very nice way, saying that the coma recovery scale is actually a scale that is designed to find some signs of cortical processing. And if you do have such non-reflex cortical processing, then you're minimally conscious state, and otherwise you're vegetative state. And that's the kind of inference we try to make and classify the patients like that. But at the same time, it's like, because we can't do otherwise, because they don't communicate with us.
Can I just make a comment too? I think sort of on what you're saying is that how you define it also depends on how you conceptualize. So you can say basically it's first-person subjective experience, and that's what it is. But if you're a person who thinks that, what we think it's instantiated in the brain, So then ultimately, theoretically, we can at some point say this X circuit of firing in neurons is consciousness. Like, do you know, well, I guess that's a question. Some people would disagree with that. Some people would think that, yes, that's the case if you take it down to that level. But a big problem is reportability. And so, yes, and if you can't report it, that's when a lot of the questions come in as well. But I mean, I guess one question is, I guess it's more of a philosophical question, is can you just define it by consciousness is that set of neurons firing, or does it always have to be this, what it feels like state?
Well, it is.
Melanie said that there may be some confusion. The 40% is a misdiagnosis of
between two states.
Between minimally conscious state
and VSS. Yeah. No,
using behavior. Yeah.
Sure.
It's using Komarikov scale like the cortical processing.
Yes. Yeah. No, I understand that.
Yeah.
So we have one with that.
So a while ago, we were talking about the potential for people to regain capacities that would make their life worth living, and brain-computer interfaces were mentioned, but I'm not entirely sure on how that would apply to people in a vegetative state, because my current understanding of brain-computer interfaces is that it involves volition of motor neurons to control an external, and which requires more.
Well, that second part's not true. But I don't know, did you hear the first session yesterday? So did you remember the man at the end who was in the wheelchair who was writing emails? So he has effectively a brain-computer interface. You start with the head mouse. It's not attached to his brain, but it's attached to a motor efferent. There are brain-computer interfaces that are implanted into the brain that bypass motor neurons entirely and are put into sensory cortices, like polymodal sensory cortices, but the point I was trying to make was the only way that he was able to do it is that he did have a motor neuron output, and this is a distinction in the existing knowledge and literature. There is no example of a patient who was able to do motor imagery or attempted communication. Even the patient that Adrian, who had the 16-year or the 20, the 16 examples of going into the scanner and communicating, they never got out with a fluent brain-computer interface. I don't know if they tried them, and probably they did, but Andrea Kugler, who did work with many locked-in patients to develop fluid BCIs using P300s, looked at 8 MCS patients, all of whom showed a clear command following signal on BCI, and she couldn't bring any of them to a criterion necessary for communication. And so there's a gap here. And if we think about this beautiful example that Alex showed us today of the opening and closing hand under anesthesia, and then knowing that there's a 2 order of magnitude difference between people who can do that and who report communicability afterwards. So that there's a range here, and somewhere between command following and communication, same thing in the John Martin data I showed, between command following and communication, there are other cognitive resources that are going to be needed to be swappable to be able to control a device when you have no motor efferents. And so far there's no example of that. That doesn't mean there can't be, or there's going to be workarounds for it, but it's future work. It's definitely not yet done.
Just so quick, what would be your definition for the panel or anybody, your definition from the conscious point of view of death? What is the definition?
Anybody want to?
Cessation of life.
Yeah, cessation, permanent cessation of organismic functioning, like these life processes, things like self-division, metabolism, respiration, etc.
So when do you know that? Just when the whole body deteriorates?
Well, that's an epistemic problem. So metaphysically, there's a point where, that happens. How we figure that out, because it turns out that you can be dead, but your cells are still metabolizing sort of for a little while, and but there's a breakdown. And this gets into some sort of integration. There's a breakdown in the integration of the things.
So then you are dead, even though
you are
still cells living.
Yeah, and you for a little while, your body might still respond to, like it can still fight off viruses and things like that for a little while.
Your fingernails are broken.
That's right.
There was another question.
Thank you. Apologies in advance because I wasn't at the sessions earlier on, but I wanted to ask if you could cast your mind forward by a few decades, and assuming that brain scanning technologies reach the capability of scanning at the neuronal level, do you, and one believes in integrated information theories, it would be possible to actually create measurements that actually integrate with the system, the brain that you're observing, and actually directly experience firsthand what that brain is doing, if it's an informational process that you could actually integrate the measuring apparatus with the brain activity itself. I know it's a pretty theoretical question, but I wanted to find out what people's thoughts were.
I think we need a theory of consciousness first. But if you had the theory of consciousness and the theory of the neural correlates, for example, of consciousness, then I take it in principle you ought to be able to figure out the neural correlates of a given state and figure out what it would take to do to your own brain to reconfigure your brain into that state. But with that theory of consciousness in hand, it's not clear why that should be impossible. I mean, there might be limits on how much you could reconfigure my brain.
But if you believe in IIT, would you be able to, in theory, integrate the information in your measuring apparatus with the
so the concept of structure, how it's generated, is you need a particular system in a particular state, yeah? Some mechanisms in a state. And so in principle, if we get to the precise description of conceptual structures, we could better understand why something visual feels like visual and auditory like auditory now. You would need to be that brain in that state to experience the same thing, you know?
Or subliminally. We are associating that with, pardon this expression, essence of what it is to be each of us. So the other thing that worries me is, on the beginning end of life, we can have biological processes, but no capacity for consciousness present, but we'd have the potential for that capacity to develop later. You carefully use the word recover the capacity. So I mean, I would like to avoid the implication that a fertilized egg, say, is someone, and that any of us was once that, as opposed to each of us has had a physiological precursor of that sort. So those are a bunch of issues. Obviously, I'm talking about what some people call the higher brain understanding of who we are and what we are and what it would be like for us to be dead.
Right. Yeah, so you take a psychological view of identity, and I guess I've written about this where I defend an organismic, more animalistic view of identity. And so I think that, I mean, if you just look at, so one argument for that is just that, presumably animals don't have any of the, let's suppose that spiders don't have consciousness, right? But we think that there's one spider, sort of from, from the whatever that it develops. So we can talk about identity. It seems like we can talk about identity conditions in all these other animals, lower animals, without talking about consciousness. So why is it that, what's so special about humans that's such that when we get to the humans, somehow we have to posit that consciousness is a necessary criterion for psychological personal identity?
But also, the other thing is you can have consciousness without having a sense of self. So, I mean, there's plenty of people who have certain types of lesions or psychiatric illnesses where they lose their sense of self, but they still have subjective states of awareness. Also, certain, babies at different stages where they don't have a sense of self yet, you can still be conscious.
Yeah, I think author, though, is talking about numerical identity rather than sort of narrative identity, where sort of whether you, but you might just
I'm not talking
reject
about self-awareness.
Yeah, you're not talking about self-awareness. You're talking about numerical. How do we count that there's one thing here? And so take the spider, right? We count that there's one spider there, even though there's no, we don't do it in psychological terms. So why do it in humans?
Well, I think identity conditions can vary according to the nature of the entity. I wouldn't be surprised if, upon reflection, I would think an elephant has to have some psychological capacities to be still there, as opposed to the bodily remains of an elephant. That we are doing a fair amount to support biology. So I don't think it has to be unique to humans, and I don't think it has to be self-conscious.
Good, but take plants, right? So we attribute identity conditions to plants, right? There's one tree here, there's one flower here, and there's no consciousness. Well, unless you're a psychist, in which case then it's all moot there,
I saw a talk on consciousness in plants earlier this year, surprisingly convincing.
Oh, right.
Actually, we just made a film that won an award. It was about consciousnness in plants.
Right,
so
right.
I'm going to promote that.
Yeah, so all bets are off if that's the case. So.
Because that gets us back to what constitutes consciousness.
Right.
Reaction, behavioral patterns are.
Yeah. So
when
just
is that sufficient, when is it not?
Yeah, just so one other thing. So if you think like, so in terms of the way I do it, in terms of organismic continuity, then you can explain plants, you can explain lower animals, you can explain, they're all sort of, it's one theory on identity, and you don't need to posit special theories for humans or higher animals.
For example, with the spiders, I feel like there's a difference between identity with the spiders and, well, just your view of identity and a conscious identity, because you can look at a dead body of a human and be like, oh, that's Doug. But the identity you're speaking of in that example isn't the same identity as, like, I talked to Doug yesterday, because I could talk to his dead body. It's not the same thing as me talking to him as he's conscious. I think there's a separation between conscious identity and just the identity that you're attributing to that spider without consciousness.
So the dead body doesn't have, on my view, doesn't have organismic continuity. There's a breakdown, so that's why it's a dead body, right? And so, and anything that has organismic continuity, then that constitutes an identity.
So it's a dead body, but it's not a dead organism.
Yeah, it's a dead body, exactly. It's a dead body, but not a dead organism. So.
Well, I think on that note, we may be done.